Hey, y'all, hello. Welcome to our webinar, Electric Avenues, Environmental Impacts of Renewable Energy Development on Desert Ecosystems. My name is Annie. I'm the outdoor educator at Anza-Borrego Foundation, and I'm going to be your host alongside Kirsten, your presenter. So, as a couple more people are funneling in, I'm going to talk a little bit about Anza-Borrego Foundation. Um, so some of you probably have heard of us, but maybe a couple have not. And so I would love to talk just a little bit about it quickly. Here we go. Perfect. So Anza-Borrego Foundation has been around since 1967, and it's the official nonprofit partner of Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. To support the park, we do three main things. We do land acquisition, which kind of helps us break down large barriers within the park for wildlife to flow freely. We also do direct park support, which kind of comes in sort of looking like the store that we have in Anza-Borrego. We also have the store in the visitor center. And then lastly, and I'm biased, so I think most importantly, are educational programs. So some of you might be familiar with the incredibly rich set of resources we have in Anza-Borrego. This is just a small sampling. We are the largest state park in California. We are also the largest contiguous park in the United States, meaning all together. We are recognized as an international dark sky park, and we have a huge array of geologic formations, thousands of archaeological and paleo sites, and 1,500 species of native flora and fauna. We also just have a lot of like endemic flora, and obviously our claim to fame and fauna is the beautiful bighorn sheep. So going back to those educational programs, we have so many things. Adventure hikes, off-road tours, plant walks with a botany society, ecological field trips, birding tours, quiet research retreat, nature photography. You can think of it. We probably have it going. We also do private tours. So if you sent us a message like, I'm looking to do something like this, we love setting up a bunch of different types of tours. And of course, the California Naturalist course. So let me see how to get out of share. So yeah, if you are interested in our educational programs, we will definitely send a link in our website in the chat. There we go. Cool. So on to tonight's presenter and our presentation, the environmental impacts of renewable energy development on desert ecosystems. Our presenter is Kirsten Dutcher. Kirsten Dutcher directs and implements research, education, and public outreach for the Steel Burnan Anza-Borrego Desert Research Center and Burns Pinyon Ridge Reserve. She is a biologist who has lived and worked extensively in the desert communities, especially those associated with the Mojave desert tortoise. Her research involves identifying the spatial distribution of genetic patterns to uncover the influence of landscape on population connectivity. The primary aim of her work is to answer questions related to the risk of population decline and extinction associated with the habitat disturbance in an effort to better inform management decisions. She's passionate about desert conservation, and also believes strongly in environmental and social commitment, fostering connection to the natural world, increased access to science and scientific tools, and quantitative approaches. She received her bachelor's degree in zoology from Oregon State University, her master's in biology from California State University, Long Beach, and her doctorate in geography from the University of Nevada, Reno. One last thing I wanted to say before I pass it off to Kirsten. I just want to let you guys know that I'm sure a bunch of questions will come up throughout our talk here. And if you do have a question, please put it in the chat. I just want to make sure that I have enabled the chat. Here we go. Y'all should be able to send messages. So as they come up, please send them in. And at the end of the webinar, we'll read them out and go over everything. Amazing. So without further ado, I would love to pass it over to Kirsten.
Annie, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. I'm sending you a request.
Of course.
All righty. Are you able to see the slides up on the screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Oh, I'm sorry, what, Annie? Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Kirsten, and Annie, thank you for that introduction. I am UC Irvine's Desert Reserve Director for both Anza-Borrego, the Steele Bernard Anza-Borrego Desert Research Center, and the Burns Pinion Ridge Reserve. Steele Bernard is located on the western edge of the subdivision of the Colorado subdivision of the Sonoran Desert, and Burns Pinion on the western edge of the Mojave Desert. I'm also a conservation biologist, more specifically a conservation geneticist, and more specifically still a desert tortoise conservation geneticist. So I'm going to start by introducing you to the star of the show, the Mojave Desert tortoise. The tortoise is the focus of my research and has been for most of my career. For those of you unfamiliar, tortoises are truly awesome animals. So awesome, in fact, that they are our state reptile. Desert tortoises are emblematic of the desert Southwest, and even their bladders are pretty awesome. Tortoise bladders can constitute up to 40% of their body weight, and they can recycle water through their system, concentrating the urine down into urates, which is an amazing adaptation to their dry desert world and can allow them to go for up to 2 years without a drink of water, which is why it's important not to make a tortoise void its bladder. One of their defense mechanisms is to void when they get scared, and that could take away their drinking supply unless it rains very, very soon. Declining rapidly. Tortoises were listed in 1989 by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because of rapid declines in population and habitat loss. Since listing, they have continued to decline, and Allison and McCluskey from the Desert Tortoise Recovery Office reported that they have lost over 1/3 of their population in the last decade alone. And here's why they're declining. Habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. Now, these are terms that you're likely familiar with. They're sometimes used interchangeably and sometimes incorrectly. But I want to take a moment to clearly define them because they do have very different and specific meanings. Habitat loss is a decrease in the amount of habitat. Amount of habitat is conclusively linked to biodiversity and survival. Basically, living things can't live without enough space in which to live. Fragmentation is a breaking apart of habitat. It's the making of islands of isolated populations. And I really like David Quammen's metaphor in his book, Song of the Dodo. So I want you to imagine a large, beautifully patterned and complex rug that has been cut into 36 pieces. Each piece is still well made and beautiful, but the rug is ruined. Pattern is ruined. Eventually, the edges begin to fray and each piece slowly unravels. Which is what habitat degradation is, the fraying of the edges and the unraveling of what is left of the habitat. So degradation relates specifically to habitat quality. I also hope that from this webinar, you get a solid understanding of the environmental consequences of utility scale solar development in the desert as it's currently being implemented. My overarching goal, though, is for everyone to really think about this question: are renewables sustainable? And I hope that this webinar will lead you to consider or reconsider or think about renewable energy development in the desert Southwest. And I'm going to be using the tortoise as a guide. And I say that because as a biologist, I view myself as a bit of an interpreter. It's my job to tell the story that tortoises themselves, that the desert itself can't. And I use genetics as a tool to let the data uncover the storyline. Specifically, I research population genetic connectivity of Mojave Desert tortoises in landscapes impacted by anthropogenic disturbance, which is almost all landscapes at this point, as far as I'm concerned. But that sentence was a mouthful: population genetic connectivity in landscapes impacted by anthropogenic disturbance. So I'm going to break it down a little. When I say population genetic connectivity, what I'm specifically referring to is gene flow. And for anthropogenic disturbance, that's human-made disturbance. And I look at whether or not there's habitat loss and fragmentation on the landscape that is producing small, isolated populations at greater extinction risk. You see, the survival probability of species in a small, isolated population depends in part on their ability to disperse or move across the landscape. So let's say I'm looking at a group of tortoises and then a large development goes in, causing habitat loss and population declines. And then let's say there's a major road fragmenting the habitat and leaving small isolated populations on either side. The habitat is further impacted by degradation resulting from these anthropogenic disturbances. While I do incorporate some habitat degradation, my work largely focuses on the bottom two here. And that's because quantifying degradation on the landscape is a tricky business. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm going to start with these two. What are the largest sources of habitat loss in the desert? Urbanization and utility scale solar. So just in case you don't know, I'm going to show you a picture of what utility scale solar looks like on the landscape. Now, this is a photo that was taken along the California-Nevada border. This is beautiful Mojave Desert scrubland. This no longer exists because when utility scale solar goes in, and this photo was taken in roughly the same location, the first thing that happens is the vegetation is generally bladed and graded, and the soil is heavily compacted. Native vegetation often does not bounce back. Once they're mowed, bladed, or graded, many desert plant species are really gone. Desert plants are generally slow growing and old. For example, Ocotillo is estimated to live for 60 years. Some studies indicate well over 100. Joshua trees are estimated to live an average of 150 years, but can reach ages of 500 or more. The federally issued environmental impact statements and biological opinions for utility scale solar facilities say things about decommissioning, which is anticipated after a 30 to 50-year life for each facility. And the decommissioning statements say things like the facility will be removed, original contours restored, and the site revegetated. I'd like to point out that this is unlikely, given that while we can try, it's very difficult to successfully remake natural contours, and that plant succession in the desert occurs very slowly and is influenced by the intensity of soil compaction. If you recall from the picture I just showed, the soil is generally heavily compacted when utility scale solar goes in. Jeff Lovich from USGS and others estimate that the recovery of desert plant communities can require up to 300 years. So the development of utility scale solar in the desert represents both short and long-term loss of habitat that can be considered permanent. So why then does habitat loss matter? It is the single greatest threat to biodiversity. Okay, now back to tortoises. As I said, I'm a conservation geneticist, so I applied genotypes in some of my work to landscape resistance surfaces. If you don't know what those are, they're basically just maps that translate the landscape into how easy or difficult it is for an animal to move through it. So here's one of the landscapes that I use. This is, again, the Ivanpah Valley, where I showed you the photograph of utility scale solar going in. It's a 625 square kilometer area, this resistance surface, and here is the scale of habitat resistance on the side specific to desert tortoises. So all these light areas represent amazing habitat that's very easy for tortoises to use and very easy for tortoises to move through. These darker reds and browns represent things like high elevation mountain ranges, or over here, a playa, that are more difficult, if not impossible, for tortoises to use and move through. Now I'm going to show you the same landscape with current levels of anthropogenic disturbance as a resistance surface. So here we have Interstate 15, the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System, which is a solar facility. Right here is State Line Solar. And these I've shown you pictures of. This is Silver State Solar. I also incorporated dirt roads on the landscape. So I applied desert tortoise genotypes to these landscape resistance surfaces with no disturbance, predictions of disturbance based off of disposable boundaries and development plans. I then ran forward in time genetic simulations to predict the impact of anthropogenic disturbance. And here's one of my results. Now, I used a measure of genetic diversity called heterozygosity. What's important for you to know is that genetic diversity is at the core of biodiversity and a species' ability to adapt to environmental change. Genetic diversity and heterozygosity are often referred to as evolutionary potential. And here's the regression result using habitat patch size as the largest patch index. And what I want you to take away from this is that as habitat patch size increases, so does genetic diversity. Conversely, as patch size decreases, genetic diversity decreases, which is very, very bad for predictions of long-term survival. In fact, the simulations I ran predicted major population crashes in about 5 generations with current levels of disturbance and future projections of disturbance in landscapes not protected from development. And tortoises aren't the only ones affected. There are all the other terrestrial species that call these developed lands home that no longer have that home. We are reducing population sizes dramatically because habitat loss and population decline go hand in hand. Again, the greatest threat to biodiversity is habitat loss. And currently, outside of urbanization, One of the greatest sources in our deserts is utility scale solar. I'm going to introduce you to the two types of solar in the desert because they have variable impacts. Photovoltaic, shown here, generates energy using solar panels. Now, I like this picture. This is, again, Silver State Solar on the California-Nevada border. But you can see the healthy Mojave Desert vegetation in the foreground with the natural contours. In the background, it's been bladed and graded, and it's flattened. You can also see a little bit of the scale of these facilities with the vehicles here. Okay. Photovoltaic generates energy using solar panels. Because utility scale solar developments are large, they require one or more large arrays, each consisting of hundreds or thousands of panels. As I said, the land is bladed and graded, and this results in a large-scale loss of native vegetation and habitat. The projects are then fenced to prevent wildlife from entering. However, some wildlife do enter, most notably birds, possibly due to something called the lake effect, which is a hypothesized risk that migrating birds, especially water birds, mistake solar arrays for bodies of water, landing or crashing into them. While this is an area that needs more study, the California Energy Commission found that water birds are attracted to the polarized light and that they change their flight patterns towards solar facilities with higher fatalities. I personally know of loons found dead in the desert just outside solar facilities, presumably because they came in for water, discovered none, and then died because loons are a species that require water for takeoff. I also know of cormorants found dead or stranded in and around solar facilities. Okay, the second type is solar thermal, also called concentrating solar power. Now, these generate energy by converting sunlight into heat. These facilities are also large and require one or more large arrays, each consisting of hundreds to thousands of mirrors, also called heliostats. So here, this is again on the California-Nevada border. This is ISIGS, the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System. And there are 3 arrays here. Each of these arrays is full of mirrors, or the heliostats. Each heliostat is about the size of a garage door. Now, what these do is they focus on a power tower, which are the bright towers seen here, to produce heat to a boiler to produce steam to generate electricity. So these facilities also require water. Flying things that pass through the concentrated light beams and overheat will be burned in midair. Birds, bats, and insects are impacted. Birds can be singed with hundreds to thousands of fatalities annually. Insects are usually straight incinerated, resulting in what are called streamers that can easily be seen with the naked eye. One estimate is that at ISIGS alone, one streamer occurs every 2 minutes. So flying things are heavily impacted by both types of facilities, just in variable ways. According to the work done by Sean Smallwood, who analyzed fatality data from 14 utility scale solar facilities in the state of California, he projected average fatalities of 10,700 bats and 126,000 birds per year, affecting up to 147 bird species, contributing substantially to the ongoing decline of birds in North America. Now, if habitat loss is extensive enough, it can result in fragmentation if it's in a linear pattern and disconnects populations that were previously connected, as shown here in this map of one of my other study areas in the desert center area of California. Desert Center is right about here. Now, there's a lot going in this map, but for the purposes of this talk, these green dots represent tortoises. This is Joshua Tree National Park, Interstate 10, and these are all utility scale solar developments and associated infrastructure. Now, since I created this map, I believe new utility solar facilities have gone in and are currently being constructed in this Riverside East development focus area. I also want to point out that this is on the California-Arizona border. So many of these facilities are being sited in areas with lower population density for humans and about as far east in California as they can be from the major urban centers they feed in the West. I'll come back to this point in a little bit. But now I want to come back to these definitions. Hopefully I've given everyone a solid understanding that habitat loss is specifically related to habitat amount, and it results in population declines, and that the impacts of habitat loss are not easily, if at all, reversible in the desert. Now I'd like to focus on fragmentation, or breaking apart of habitat. If you recall, I said that fragmentation reduces the survival probability of species if they cannot adequately disperse or move across a landscape. While fragmentation can and does occur from habitat loss, as in the example I just showed you of the desert center area, classically, it's considered to be the result of something that doesn't cause a large area of land to be lost. Something that's not wide, something that cuts through. Something like a road. Now, here's the problem with roads. They tend to kill a lot of wildlife. So if you're in a wild area without a lot of roadkill, it could mean that not a lot of people drive there, or that folks drive real careful, or that something else has depressed populations of local wildlife. It could also mean that there's a road effect. And again, that's because roads kill a lot of wildlife, including tortoises. And I've seen roadkill, including tortoises, all too often. I'm sure you have too if you notice roadkill. I don't like looking at this, so I'm going to move away from it and still talk about it. Road mortality reduces populations of dispersing individuals. So those that are trying to go from point A to point B, as well as individuals whose home range includes the road. So those who maybe have a burrow on one side of the road, but forage or mate on the other side of the road. Beyond the immediate vicinity of the road, invasive plants and introduced predators can spread. Illegal collection of wildlife sometimes increases. In desert tortoises, it has been found that major roads depress populations up to 400 meters, that's almost half a kilometer, away from the road. So in my work with desert tortoises in the Ivanpah Valley, that's the location on the California-Nevada border, I analyzed population genetic structure using a Bayesian clustering analysis. Don't worry if that doesn't mean anything to you, but what I want you to understand is that it's similar to something like 23andMe, where each individual in this graph is represented by a bar in the graph and assigned to a population represented by color. So in this example, there are 4 tortoises. Each tortoise gets its own bar in the graph. So we have 4 bars, and there are 3 colors, which mean there are 3 genetic clusters or genetic populations. And in this example, there's admixture or a sharing of genetic material indicating gene flow. So here's a map of my study area in Ivanpah. I'm going to go back for a second because these site names from Mesquite to Paiute match up with these names here, Mesquite to Paiute Valley over here. I also want to point out the landscape features, some of which I've talked about quite a bit at this point. We have Interstate 15, the Southern Pacific Railway. This is I6, the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System. This is State Line Solar of Golf Course and Silver State Solar, which I've also shown you a fair number of pictures of. The X's represent mines, and this frazzle of gray lines across the area are utility corridors, mostly power lines and dirt roads. So using that Bayesian clustering technique, I found 3 population genetic clusters that correspond with past population structure based off of the landscape features. So here we have El Dorado Paiute separated from Ivanpah Valley by this large mountain range right here, and then this group of very adventurous mountain tortoises up here. But I kept detecting something else in this cluster, something more cryptic and more recent in time. So I used multiple spatially explicit landscape approaches, and every approach converged on the same answer, which is that Interstate 15 and the railway have fragmented populations that were previously connected. Now, these linear features have been on the landscape for 80 to 140 years, which is about 4 to 7 tortoise generations. Tortoise generation is about 20 years, the time that it takes to reach sexual maturity. It's considered a generation. And 4 to 7 generations, it's actually 5, is about when we would expect to start picking up the genetic effects of anthropogenic disturbance. And fragmentation by roads has been found to negatively impact many other species as well, including Jerusalem crickets, bighorn sheep, coyote, mule deer, mountain lion, most snake, turtle, and lizard species. So I'm going to take a minute to tie this all together here, again using tortoises, but this could apply to most any other species you would like to imagine. Utility scale solar results in habitat loss, reduced habitat amount for native species, and increased mortality for many. When solar installations are large and or configured to bisect an area, they can also fragment habitat, isolating individuals into smaller groups that are no longer connected. New roads are often created, and they often go through populations that have not yet experienced the road effect. So not only are they fragmenting the population, but they result in a period of higher mortality until all or most animals that use habitat near the road have been impacted, and the population along the roadway declines for some distance from the road. Okay, back to the goals. So habitat loss is a decrease in habitat amount. Fragmentation is a breaking apart of habitat. Hopefully everyone understands that fragmentation isolates individuals that were formerly connected to each other through movement across the landscape. I'm just going to say it one last time. The survival probability of species in small isolated subpopulations depends in part on their ability to disperse and move across a landscape. It's a very important concept in conservation biology. Now I would like to move on to habitat degradation, the most insidious and difficult to quantify of the 3. Merriam-Webster defines insidious as having a gradual and cumulative effect. In my forward in time models, I incorporated dirt roads and transmission lines on the landscape, both of which are sometimes assumed to have a minor impact. And this is one of the landscapes that I looked at, Dry Lake, Nevada, with no anthropogenic disturbance. Again, the resistance scale, all of this light yellow represents habitat that's easy to use, easy to move through. Here it is with current levels of disturbance, and I've just overlaid the utility scale solar and the mass of dirt roads and transmission lines on this landscape. I again used that forward in time simulation approach I mentioned earlier to make predictions related to extinction risk. Now, in case you're curious about what this would look like as a resistance surface, here's how it translates. One of the metrics that I used to evaluate risk is a connectivity success index to predict how well landscapes maintain gene flow over time. And I use this statistic called FST, which is a measure of genetic differentiation. So basically, when you have a landscape with no disturbance, that would be maximum gene flow, N of 1. A landscape with complete fragmentation, no gene flow, would be a 0. The dry lake landscape that I just showed you had a connectivity success index of 0.55, indicating that a considerable loss of connectivity has occurred largely because of dirt roads and transmission lines. I also found a 24% predicted loss in desert tortoise population size. And this is supported by the findings of Sarah Carter from USGS and colleagues, and she found that 70% of desert tortoise habitat has some form of development within 1 kilometer. And that tortoises essentially disappear from a landscape when 10% of the habitat within 1 kilometer is altered by humans. Now, there are lots of ways that we alter habitat. I briefly mentioned urbanization, and I've talked a lot about utility scale solar, roads, and dirt roads. OHV use contributes to the proliferation of dirt roads because people don't always stay in their lane and they like to create new routes. As an aside, there are also additional health concerns associated with producing this much dust. Human infrastructure, roads, and OHVs also add to degradation in other ways, including, but not limited to, the spread of invasive weeds. In this picture, some of the yellow stuff are Mediterranean grasses, schismus and bromus. Now, these invasive species do so well in our deserts that they can replace natives by outcompeting for resources. This in turn alters food availability for many natives. These invasive grasses also increase the prevalence and severity of wildfire in the desert Southwest, which has been increasing steadily since the 1970s. You see, these Mediterranean grasses are drought tolerant and fire adapted. When you replace usually bare desert spaces with a blanket of fine fuel, wildfire risk increases. After a fire in the desert, schismus and bromus often come back very well, while native desert plants, which are not fire adapted, tend to decrease. Loss, fragmentation, and degradation are interconnected in ways that can be difficult to isolate and tease apart. Degradation feeds into itself on a positive feedback loop, making it more complicated, that can promote degradation in the same form. Dirt roads tend to lead to more dirt road proliferation across the landscape, and also feed into itself by degradation in different and sometimes unexpected forms, invasive species, wildfire risk, etc. Okay, so in this picture, I just want to point out the line of the utility scale solar development. Outside of the footprint, you can see native vegetation and those native contours. Inside, it is scraped, bladed, and graded, and these are large facilities. So when we add utility scale solar to the desert landscape, we create new roads, new transmission lines, often new dirt roads, and sometimes unauthorized dirt roads. Weeds tend to increase, as does wildfire risk, resulting in a habitat that may be unrecognizable or uninhabitable for the species that live there. So in case this was not clear, habitat loss and fragmentation contribute to degradation. There is never a hard, clean line around a development. a road, or a transmission line where the disturbance ends and the natural world is unaltered. The footprint is much larger than the development. And one way that I sometimes think about the issue of dirt roads and transmission lines and degradation in general is by thinking of it as death of a landscape by 1,000 cuts. While the effects of large developments result in obvious losses in habitat and declines in biodiversity, this is referring to something that's more gradual and often unnoticed decline of what remains. Now, the construction of transmission lines has increased across our desert landscapes. As I noted earlier, we sometimes put utility scale solar far from the cities that they feed. And here's why. Well, here's one reason why, at least. Old fossil fuel regulations provide larger federal subsidies for longer transmission lines. The longer the line, the more energy lost in transmission. Now, this presents a large number of issues. I've already mentioned the energy lost in transmission, which I think is a substantial issue. For another, transmission lines on the outset, as I've said, don't appear to result in too much habitat loss, and their fragmentation effects are not well studied. It's commonly assumed that the impacts are not severe. My colleague Steve Ramada spent loads of time tracking tortoises in the desert. He used traditional radio telemetry and GPS data loggers to record a GPS point every 30 minutes in his studies of movement ecology, and this is a tortoise with a logger right there. Using a path selection analysis, he found that tortoise movements are altered by anthropogenic landscape features. So tortoises tend to move along barriers like fences, flood control berms, and railroads. It's a behavior called pacing. 86% of his animals had a dirt road within their home range. Now, each animal crossed that dirt road at least once, so that's an increased risk of mortality or collection. But they all avoided the dirt road to some extent relative to the path selection analysis. So all of these things alter desert tortoise movements, including dirt roads. Now here's another species that's affected by anthropogenic disturbance, the raven. My favorite bird, which is very, very odd for a tortoise biologist, but here's why ravens are cool. They are really, really smart. They have a large cerebral cortex, which is the part of the brain thought to be responsible for high-level functions associated with reasoning, consciousness, and emotion. They're super social, inquisitive, and they love to play. If you're interested in learning more, I suggest you check out the work of Bernd Heinrich, an ornithologist and author of the book Mind of the Raven. They're also subsidized predators. Ravens are much maligned as harbingers of tortoise death, and sage grouse, and snowy plover, and Mojave ground squirrel, and a lot of other things. And that's because they eat them. Now, this is natural for ravens and presents no particular issue in a system at equilibrium. I'm going to pause here and point out that I'm using the term equilibrium very loosely, as change and adaptation are inherent in all natural systems. However, and I'm going to come back to rate of change later in this talk, the rate of environmental change has been far too rapid for most species to keep up with, hence massive numbers of declining, threatened, and endangered species. Subsidized predators are those that survive well in the presence of humanity, and they are exceptions. Ravens like our trash, and they like our food and our pet food, and this has resulted in population increases across North America. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that raven populations have almost doubled in the last 50 years. They also like our roads and our power lines. Power lines provide excellent nesting sites for ravens and allow them to access parts of the desert that would otherwise be largely uninhabitable or off limits to them. And of course, they eat things that are not produced by humans, adding in another little cut to the thousands. Now we've chosen to deal with ravens in a myriad of ways by shooting them, poisoning them, oiling their eggs, and most recently using deterrents like drones and lasers. So let me tie this big picture in one last time. When we add solar to our desert wildlands, roads increase, transmission lines increase, access increases, weeds increase, wildfire risk increases, and subsidized predators increase. And I'd like to remind you that these all feed into each other, and the impacts of habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation only compound and increase over time, resulting in a habitat matrix that's often unrecognizable and uninhabitable for native species. Okay, so I think that we've covered the big three: habitat loss associated with a decrease in habitat amount. Fragmentation is a breaking apart of habitat, and degradation relates to habitat quality. And we've started to uncover some of the environmental consequences of utility scale solar development. Now it's time to move on to climate change. Renewables are touted as solutions to climate change. Correction: anthropogenic climate change. Natural systems, as I mentioned earlier, are always changing, and this does include climate. The difference between natural and anthropogenic can be simplified in some ways by thinking about rate of change. Bill Nye the Science Guy has broken it down like this. If I'm in a car and I go from 60 to 0 miles per hour, is that a problem? Well, it depends on how I stop and the rate of change. The answer is no if I drive to my house and slowly reach 0 by parking in my driveway. The answer is yes if I'm going 60 and come to a sudden and complete stop because I hit something. So it is with climate change. Now, there are a number of future climate change scenarios ranging from not too bad to pretty darn terrible. We decide which scenario will become our reality through our actions. William Rees from the University of BC posits that we've already missed the mark for that not too bad target, because as of 2023, renewables provided only 2.3% of our energy after decades of deployment. His data show that in some years, new renewable energy developments did not even keep pace with new energy demands, much less replace fossil fuels. So what does this mean for tortoises? In her analysis of climate change and land use, my colleague Anjana Prantaman built range-wide habitat suitability models for desert tortoises to reflect present-day conditions shown here. So the green is tortoise habitat in Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and California over here. And she forecast habitat under future climate scenarios. And here's one of her 2098 models. Notice there's a lot less green, and that a fair bit of it is starting to run further to the north than in their current range. But for tortoises to move, and these are long distances for a tortoise to go, they will need a well-connected and relatively undisturbed habitat, and also several generations in which to move. Okay, we're not quite done exploring the environmental consequences of utility scale solar development, but I want to remind you of my overarching goal for this webinar, which is for everyone to really think about the question, are renewables sustainable? I would argue that they are not under our current model of development, where we have sited facilities far away with long transmission lines. I want to reiterate that this means habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation of our desert landscapes that we have not known or seen before, and that probably can never be recovered. Transmission lines also result in a loss of energy. The longer the line, the greater the loss, which is inherently wasteful. If renewables only account for 2.3% of our energy consumption, I would think that we would be very concerned with reducing the length of our transmission lines to reduce the amount of energy that's produced and lost in transmission. For example, here we are back in ISIGS on the California-Nevada border. This facility is in California. It's a 14 square kilometer facility on public BLM land. The biological opinion states that the life of the facility is predicted to be 30 to 50 years. And recently, PG&E announced that they are pulling out of ISIGS less than 15 years after its construction because it is cost prohibitive. There are over 200 miles of transmission lines from this facility on the Nevada border to Western California, and it's estimated that it loses 40 to 60% of the energy that it produces in transmission. That is a lot of energy loss, a lot of habitat loss, plants, birds, bats, and tortoises, not to mention the economic costs. So I would argue that these things could be less of an issue if we took steps to break this cycle instead of continuing with an infinite and expendable resource view. If we didn't apply subsidies to renewables far from urban centers, and if we looked to distribute it instead of utility scale solar. Okay, now I'm going to talk about carbon sequestration and soil crusts for a minute, but I want to note that what I'm about to say is very preliminary and no one should hang their hat on it. A 2009 report by Holly Campbell from OSU notes that the loss of native desert vegetation releases CO2, and that desert soils, especially cryptobiotic soils, could represent significant carbon sinks. Now, as I said, this is preliminary and it's an area that remains under study. But we don't yet understand if utility scale solar development in the desert will result in greater carbon releases or prevent sequestration than the facilities themselves will offset. So if we consider the possible loss of carbon sequestration, along with our growing energy needs, failure to substantially reduce emissions, and energy lost in transmission, we actually may see little benefit to climate change scenarios at a great cost to our desert wildlands. This is a pretty sad place for me to end off on this story, so I want to leave you for a moment with some pictures of our amazing deserts. Okay. Back to the goals. So hopefully everybody is familiar and very comfortable with the meaning and the use of habitat loss specific to habitat amount, fragmentation specific to a breaking apart, and degradation to a reduction in habitat quality. And hopefully I've made it clear that there's an interplay of these things with utility scale solar development. As for the question, are renewables sustainable? Well, it's something that I've obviously given a lot of thought to because researching habitat loss and fragmentation on desert tortoise populations has been my life's work. So as I said earlier, I would argue that no, renewable energy development is not sustainable as currently being implemented on the landscape. However, I'll leave that for each of you to consider for yourselves. I really appreciate that everyone has taken the time to attend this webinar and educate themselves about this topic. But if you want to do something to move towards positive change for both protecting our deserts and increasing renewable energy, I believe that you can. You can spread the word and we can all make more educated choices. By taking personal responsibility and reducing our footprint where we're able, even in the littlest of ways, it could potentially compound and add up over time. You can also support development of renewable energy in already disturbed areas close to urbanization. If you're so inclined, you can get involved in changing old fossil fuel policies that are being inappropriately applied to solar. Finally, you can support rooftop solar initiatives, and this is a novel one, utility distributed solar initiatives. I think I said finally too soon, because if you want to get involved directly right now, you can join the Anza-Borrego Foundation in their fight to stop the power line from being put through Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. One of our last remaining wilderness areas, the largest desert state park in our country. You can find out more about this effort on their website or contact them directly. And with that, I'd like to thank you all sincerely for your time today. I'd also like to acknowledge the University of California, Irvine, UCI Nature, and the Anza-Borrego Foundation, as well as all of my collaborators whose work I mentioned in this talk. And I'm happy to take any questions or open it up for discussion.
Thank you. That was an incredible presentation. I just got a message that our chat is still disabled, even though I went to enable it. So I want to see if I can try that again. Let's see if that worked. And while we are getting some questions in, I just want to acknowledge everyone that's here and give a huge thank you from all of us at Anza-Borrego Foundation for purchasing your registration ticket to attend. Of all the education programs at the foundation, it's all supported by registration fees, donations to the public, from the public, and through the retail store. So if you haven't yet felt called to support our future programs, let me just put in the chat those two links. The first link is to all of our events, educational events, and then the second link is to our online store. We invite everyone to shop at our retail store, either in person, if you're in Borrego, or online. The store is the official state park store in the visitor center, as well as our second location that's in the mall. All of the proceeds go to support Anza-Borrego Foundation and the state park. And so with all of that, on to questions. Emily said now it's working. Beautiful. We have a question from Kaylin. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. The question is, I missed whether power lines affected tortoise movement, and if so, why?
Hi, Kaylin. Thanks for the question. So the power lines that Steve Hermata looked at were associated with dirt roads. So all the power lines that went through the home ranges of the tortoises that he was looking at had a dirt road for access to that power line. So there's, when we're talking about power lines, there's often a dirt road associated with that power line. So the effects of a dirt road are going to apply to a power line. And then there are the additional effects which don't impact tortoise movement per se, but have to do with things like subsidized predators like ravens, coming in and building nesting sites and decimating populations of little hatchling tortoises. So really for the impacts on tortoise movement, the power line road is essentially the same as a dirt road.
They said, got it, thanks. Any other questions? Emily said, fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. This is a presentation that everyone should see.
Thank you, Emily.
I can't help but agree. Okay, I'll give it a couple more minutes to see if any other questions come through. All right, we have a question. Any studies of wind turbines affecting desert tortoises?
None that I am aware of, but Ben Zyla, are you aware of any studies that have included desert tortoises for wind farms? To the best of my knowledge, although this is an assumption, so but I have never known of wind farms placed in tortoise habitat. I'm not saying that there aren't any in there, but it really tends to be utility scale solar. In my limited experience with wind farms, they tend to be up on mountain passes and in areas that are in more black brush habitat, when they're in the desert and outside of what is typically expected of tortoise habitat. But I don't know that I'm unaware of anyone looking at that issue. Or others.
Says that question was from Jim.
Yeah. I don't know.
All right, Amanda said, thank you for doing this. Well done, excellent presentation. All right, y'all, if there's no further questions, I think we might wrap up for the night.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, ABF, for this opportunity to talk about my research.
Thank you again. This was wonderful.
Great night.
Good night.